Hello, I'm Nick Knoth. Welcome to the Como Vanguard podcast. This is the companion show to the Como Vanguard written publication available on Substack. You can find more information and past reporting, as well as links to submit questions for the show and support the show at comovanguard.com.
Purpose of this podcast is to take a closer look at what the Columbia City Council does in its meetings and also other decisions that are made and other topics that come up in regard to the city. Have we had any questions yet, Nick?
No, I was just looking this morning and we haven't yet. Not too many takers just yet. So someone out there, you could be the very first person to submit a question to the show.
You might have to bribe them, offer a prize. Come and sit and watch one of these.
That's right. We'll give you a special shout out on the show by answering your question.
So this city council meeting that we're going to talk about, do you want to jump right into it, or do you have anything else you want to take care of before we start?
Well, I suppose we should start with our guest.
Yes, hello.
No pressure. So to help us do what we do, which is talk city council and all things city hall, we have Sydney Olsen with the city of Columbia. Sydney, I can never remember your title. What is your title?
That is because it is so long, so it's okay. I am the Engagement and Public Communications Manager.
All right.
So I'm curious, before we get right into the meeting, I'm curious as about what you do prior to a city council meeting to help the city manager and, if you do, help council members prepare for what they're going to be talking about. I don't understand what happens behind the scenes.
Sure, that's a great question. A lot of my time is spent fielding interview requests. So I think both of you know we have more journalists per capita, we like to joke, in this town than probably anywhere in the world. And so I often look at the topics that I anticipate reporters or student reporters will be asking about and then anticipating what communications we'll need to have ready for them. That's not hard because our staff spends so much time putting together council memos and presentations for the council meeting, but sometimes it involves me sitting down with staff and helping prepare them for those interviews or do a practice interview if they feel that's necessary. And council will occasionally ask for information as well, but typically they are pretty proactive about looking at what's on the agenda. And if they have questions, they send that to staff the day of the meeting.
How does your TV background help do what you do?
So I always like to joke that we're the weird ones. People aren't comfortable being on camera, like the normal person, okay? Right, even on radio.
I don't want to be on camera, so it's much easier to be what we're doing right now, just sitting behind a microphone and not caring what we look like.
Yeah, it's a different world, and I have to constantly remind people of that. And so I see it as my job, largely one aspect of it, is to help equip people on staff to utilize our media partners. So I always tell them, like, we're a tool for them, but they're a tool for us too. And we can't shy away from them, especially in our news market here in town. And so I would like to think that I'm equipped to help prepare them for interviews. So I'll sit down a lot of times and usually my first question is, what's the one question you don't want them to ask? And let's practice how we're going to respond.
Interesting. We may have to pursue that a little bit more because I'm very curious about that. And I want to talk, and Nick, I know we'll talk later on about the conversation last night or at the city council meeting about the communications, I guess, department, because I have some questions about that, but I don't want to jump into that right now. But I do want to know when the council or a city manager, how do they talk about what they anticipate as far as a meeting is concerned and public comment at a meeting, or what will gather the most information?
As far as at the meeting, I think we typically know because we have our regulars. And we have a ton of Facebook pages in town. I'm sure everyone's familiar who kind of pick up on things. So we have a pretty good idea based on what reporters are asking about and what people are talking about online as far as what public comment we're going to get and questions that we'll get. So typically I would say council's questions align pretty closely with that as well because they want to be prepared to answer questions that they anticipate coming up.
We're not commercially supported or anything, so I want you to try to step away from what would be the standard response to this. But I'm curious as to if you're
Oh boy.
ever surprised, and again, you worked in TV.
hmm
I like to look at the agenda, and then when I read what the newspapers are focusing on, and I see what television stations are focusing on, sometimes I don't want to say I laugh, but I at least am slightly amused at what they choose to focus on from an upcoming meeting. Do you ever have that kind of reaction?
Yes, selfishly, I covered city council for, about 2 years during my time at KMIZ. I was the city beat reporter. So I do judge a little bit based on what I would have done. I will say I've seen a little bit of getting away from beat reporting in the newsroom, so it's not always the same reporters, and I think that makes a difference too because, like, again, with being on camera or doing a podcast, we are probably the unusual folks in the room that pay close attention to city council meetings. Obviously, we would like our residents to do more of that, but I think our media partners are somewhat of the same way. It's really complex if you're like, "What is public comment versus intro and first read, etc." So sometimes I don't think they fully understand the agenda, and that's something we're always trying to kind of get over and retrain because we know we have new reporters coming in all the time.
Nick, I think you pointed out in these conversations that we've had in this podcast, even probably on the first one, when we talk about how the city council does its work, you have made the comment about sometimes people think that a first read is going to be one of the key points of a meeting, and it's not. It's telling you, get ready in the future for
Mhm.
something like that. So again, it's an education that I think we all are interested in doing. And then some of the topics, which are important topics, for example, the culvert under Oak Plank Road, which is an interesting topic and needs to be taken care of, but it is kind of like a housekeeping type of deal. And that was the focus of one of the TV stories leading up to the meeting. And I watched that with my wife and I said, that's an important, especially for that area. That's key. But of all the things to pick out from the meeting, I was shocked that that was the one that had the story.
No. Same. I don't know what to say. I mean, yeah, that's not a
I
very
think
sexy story, but that's
I
okay.
think that's called filler. For whether it's TV or radio, whomever, I think sometimes they're just looking for filler.
I will say, as the former weekend evening host, there are times when you're really grasping at straws.
I'm going to keep my mouth shut on that
Yep.
because I have other opinions as far as that is concerned. But again, I appreciate your giving us a background on that. But again, it is always kind of one of those. Let's see what's going to be the focus and see whether it's how close it hits to the center of the dartboard on what is going to be the crucial thing that happens in a meeting.
I will say too, if I may add, I find that more often the focus of the news tends to follow kind of what's happening on social media
Yeah.
too. That's much more of a popular tool, I guess, for them these days. And I think they kind of see, oh, people are chatting about this, chatting about that. So there's obviously interest.
Let's do a story on it, even if let's do a story on it and make it a story,
Yes.
right? Because Facebook is reality
Oh, and
for
I've
some
always said
people.
that.
Some people, yes, yes. We have a different philosophy here at Como Vanguard.
Yeah.
Well, we hope to hit what's most important. And again, the covert story is important for the people out at Old Plank, and there's a reason that that's going to be done, but it doesn't really interest a whole lot of the community.
Mhm.
Other things that are going to interest the community was what was talked about during the pre-council meeting. So we get into what was talked about in the pre-council meeting, which was a very nice presentation, and everybody can go to the agenda, and it's on the como.gov website. If you go down to, I think, events, and then go to that particular date, and you can see it. 40 some slides, 46 slides that were presented. Now, do you have any role in the presentation of that, or is that staff that comes up with this slide presentation that is going to lead to one of the topics that I think Nick and I will lead into?
Yeah, so in this example, our finance department put that together because I always joke, like, you're the numbers people. Let me help put it into English to the best of my ability. So in this case, they put those slides together and then I reviewed them with the staff that worked on them. And we kind of went through what's clear, what's unclear. One example we were talking about an example talking about buying groceries, which are taxed at a different rate. And I don't want to bore people with this, but Matthew Liu, our finance director, was like, that might be unclear because he started getting into the specifics of how they're taxed differently. And I texted him during last night's pre-council meeting when a question came up about that. And I was like, that answers that. We're taking it out for the public presentation to potentially go on the website later.
Which one was that? Because I'm looking at, you're talking about groceries. I thought it was pretty good. And I think one of the stories this morning, maybe in the Missourian, was talking about how if what we're haven't talked about yet, but that would be raising the city sales tax so that it would be dedicated as additional funds for public safety.
Correct.
Not taking away what is already being given to public safety from the general funds of the city's budget, but this would be additional funding so that we could improve or add to public safety in this community.
Yeah, so this would be a special revenue fund dedicated specifically to police and fire. And we're exploring this for a number of reasons. But we've been talking in the last several years about how, just generally speaking, expenditures and revenue aren't keeping pace with each other at the city. There's a trend nationwide, and we're seeing it here locally, where sales taxes are going down. So we're not getting the same revenue. And that's not necessarily stopping us from growing. So we have more streets to pave. We've got new development where we need fire to be able to respond quickly and meet what's required by our accreditation, for example. Same thing with police. And so, as we look at the future years and we can see how those lines are coming closer and closer together, we're trying to be proactive and anticipate how we can continue to provide the level of service our residents expect. So that's how this discussion really came about.
I don't want to hog this, Nick.
No, you're
I've
fine.
already
So
gone into the subject that I think is a pretty good subject.
yeah, so to clarify for folks, what we're talking about is a 1% sales tax that would be dedicated to public safety. And what that means when they say public safety, when the city says that, is both the operational overhead for police officers and firefighters in terms of staffing, equipment, all those things, but also facilities. So that is, renovating fire stations, the police headquarters downtown needs to probably be bulldozed and rebuilt.
Yes, absolutely. Yes.
I don't know if that's what they'll actually end up doing, but something to that degree, I'm sure will come about if and when the funding is acquired, whether it's through the sales tax or another opportunity. I did think it was noteworthy last night that when the discussion was going about, like, is this the best path? And DeCarlo Seawood, city manager, and other council members, Matthew Liu, finance director, et cetera, were all talking about this. That there was like, well, what if we did a hybrid approach, right? Or why don't we do property tax instead? And I think those are very valid questions that your average person would ask them, right?
Hmm.
And so I thought it was interesting that on the property tax side, staff seemed pretty adamant that that's probably not the best way to go in terms of funding stability and opportunity or feasibility. And then the hybrid approach, which, funny enough, I think Betsy Peters was the one to remember this because I think she was on council then,
Yeah,
which
she's
is
our
why
most senior council member.
she's the only council member who was on council there, and probably one of the only people in the room who was with the city back then, other than maybe Sheila Amin, who I'm sure also remembers, given that she dug it up. But that the city tried a hybrid approach for dedicated public safety funding in 2014. The hybrid approach being partially funding it by property tax, partially funding it by sales tax, which requires two separate ballots that citizens have to vote yes on both for them to become effective. Well, in 2014, when they did this, it failed, which is another reason why city staff in proposing this is saying, let's just choose one path. We think that path should be sales tax, and this is what we want to do with it, right? They said 50 new police officers, 40 new firefighters over the course of 4 years for both of those, 2 new fire stations, police vehicles, all these things that they say aren't really possible with current fundings, given, as Sydney noted, funding for the general fund, which is primarily sales tax funded, is flat, if not declining.
Right. And I will say too, historically, the city has not done a great job anticipating growth and what needs to come with that. And so we're finding ourselves in a position right now, and DeCarlin and I have chatted about this quite a bit, about how, our city's grown and grown and grown, and whether we fight it or embrace it, it grows with or without us. And so now we're finding that we need new fire stations. And like you said, the police department downtown, that building has been several things in its lifetime. And she's not pretty. And we're pumping a lot of money into just maintaining it. And so having that conversation of, okay, well, the city's grown this way and this way, where would it make sense to have our police officers? And then another big aspect of this tax, too, is regarding the pensions for fire and police, which I'm not a pension expert by any means, but we have a lot of conversation with our unions specifically about stabilizing our pension plans. And so there's been a lot of discussion about potentially moving them onto loggers, which is a well-known governmental pension plan.
I think the pension is an important discussion, but I don't know enough about that to be able to really um, ask much about that. So I know we're not
Great.
going to spend a long time on that. But a couple of things that I do want to ask about. I want to go back to one of the things you said as far as the slides were concerned. I thought it was very helpful to see that if a percent increase does pass, on $100 purchase of groceries, how much that would impact. That would be a dollar more. So you'd be paying a dollar more if you spent 100 on groceries. So I think those were helpful. But some questions that I had, one is that a basic question that is not a Columbia Central question. It's a question that I think people have, and I've heard it from others, and I've had it also. With growth, how come receipts don't grow also to cover the cost of growth?
That is a good question. I think part of it is just the cost of being alive these days, to be honest. We saw sort of a spike of revenue come in during COVID when people were receiving checks and funding during that time to help support them. And then we saw a vast decline following that. I think just with the cost of living and the cost of goods these days, people's spending habits are changing. And like I said, we're seeing that across the nation, and I think people are just cutting back. Christmas time is or the holidays is a great example. They talked about that during pre-council last night, how it's very unusual that we don't see, an increase in spending around the holidays, and I think for the last 2 years in a row, it's been about a plateau.
And I think they said last night, to your point, that this past holiday for 2025 was like the lowest in many years. And I think another aspect of this, David, as well, is that the cost of infrastructure which supports development, whether that is roads, utilities, fire stations, whatever, that has seen such significant inflation beyond and above anything that you or I or Sydney have seen in terms of groceries or what have you. Those costs have risen again just exponentially to where the rates and taxes that have been in effect to support those just not remotely keeping up with the cost.
Yeah.
Right.
Yes, I will say a lot of the things we have to purchase for utilities, for example, cost 3 times what they did before the pandemic. And when we look at projects, dare I say, like the transmission line,
Mhm.
um, yes, I know that's contentious, but when things are delayed and potentially come back in the future, well, now it may cost, depending on what it is, 2 or 3 times as much to do the project that we were originally
Right.
discussing.
And those are all good answers. And I anticipated that. I just wanted to let people hear
Mhm.
saying, gosh, if there's been so much growth, if Colombia's population has gone up 50% within a short time period, why are we talking about lack of funding when we have 50% more people to pay sales taxes or property taxes? So good answer. My other questions have to concern with, in addition, first of all, we're talking about the city council having to act pretty quickly to get an August ballot issue on whether there would be a percent sales increase for covering safety. And as Nick pointed out, it would mean hiring X number of police officers over a 4-year period or whatever, and the same with firefighters. And you mentioned pension. In addition to adding workers and adding or helping with the pension, it increase opening salaries because I think that goes into making it appealing to be a public safety officer, either firefighter or police officer in this city.
Think the way that ties in is sort of indirectly, but it does have an impact. So, a couple years ago, for some context, the city did a classification and compensation study. Our current city manager has made a commitment to employees in the last several years to put them first. And really, when we say that, that means we're going to look at providing raises as appropriate before potentially adding on additional services. And we saw a big increase for the way our police officers are paid and following that study. And we've seen a big increase as a result of more recruitment for our officers. And so I think as we continue to make those commitments to employees, the cost of hiring anyone increases. And, police officers specifically, I think it costs, oh, what did they say, like $150,000 for one officer.
135.
Uh-huh.
Okay, I
I
was
saw
off,
that.
but yes. So, it is gonna have some indirect impact on that if we have those discussions. And I will say too, like, council last night talked about looking at the revenue and expenditures, how that's been impacted by the raises that have been given. So all of that is all connected and has to go into the decision-making factor moving forward.
Help me understand also in regard to passage of this, and I'm looking at the chart that's on here, talking about the sales tax and then what would be additional sales tax. And then they also include use tax. So I don't understand use tax in regard to the sales tax.
Okay, that's a great question. So, the use tax, which was commonly referred to as the Wayfair tax, is taxes on purchases that are coming from outside of Colombia. So, we've seen the shopping trends change tremendously in
So
the
why is it
last.
called? I hear what you're saying. So why is it called use tax? Because that doesn't explain what it is.
It's a regulatory thing by the state. So It's
It's
something that
what is
had
it?
to
That's
be.
use of internet sales tax? I mean,
That's
that's
not a bad way to think of it,
yeah.
but it is because when entities like Amazon, right, which is obviously kind of the behemoth, began to take up such a tremendous amount of sales tax revenue that was just lost because the laws at the time, Missouri and really around the country, did not have a mechanism for taxing an online sales entity, especially one that did not exist in their state or jurisdiction. And so there was the Wayfair court case, which then authorized the Wayfair taxes, which had to be put to a vote, which the city did. And so that's why it's a separate thing, is because legally it has to be because of state regulations on how it is viewed. It's very, to you and I and everyone else, it doesn't make any sense. Like it's all one
It's
thing.
a horrible type.
Yes.
Because when I
Yes.
looked at that and I was thinking use tax, does that mean then when I call the police or I call the fire, I have to pay? Because that's
Right.
using that service. I mean, just like that's what I think the mind
Yeah, I really don't know why. I mean, I wasn't involved in that line of thinking, but I will say from a messaging standpoint, when we were talking about that tax, I kind of used it in a sense of these are still companies or agencies like using our resources. So when Amazon comes and delivers a package on your front porch, they're using our streets. And when that
Mm.
package potentially, but hopefully not, gets stolen, you're calling the police to respond. I'm not saying that happens often, but you know what I mean. I kind of used it in our messaging on the educational piece of what it is. But yeah, it kind of had the two names because most people referred to it as the Wayfair tax. So we usually had to start those
Right.
presentations with this is what most people are calling the Wayfair tax.
and that would
Yes.
be helpful. I'm speaking to media now to always explain what that is because you do have to go back if you've been in media and kind of define things in terms that people understand rather than what the legal definition is because
Right.
sometimes that doesn't resonate with the people. So on page or on 37 of this, it seems to me like when looking at the use tax projection here, and I
Mhm.
understand that that is figured in on the green on this chart, and I apologize for podcast listeners who don't know. My question basically is, I would think as people spend less on stores within Columbia and they spend more on internet purchases, that use tax would be a larger portion of this. And I don't know if that's not reflected real well over the even the current years.
Yeah, and the chart he's referring to is into the millions, so it kinda gets condensed and is hard to read, but I think we anticipated use tax would be slightly higher than what it is, but I think, again, that comes back to sort of the spending habit and the changes we're seeing in that area, just generally across the board. I do think our stores in town are seeing the impacts of that, but I also think people are ordering less online and just doing less shopping, if I'm being
Yeah,
honest.
I do. Yeah, I agree. I think it doesn't matter if it's Amazon or the speckled frog next door to where we're sitting now. Everyone's sales have kind of softened, right? And then the finance team for the city spoke about this last night, where all these projections, there's a lot of numbers, a lot of projections going 5, 10 years out. And when talking about this sales tax idea, they're taking a very conservative approach to it, which I think to, as David's observation of where they have the use tax forecasted is the same as sales tax in terms of they're forecasting that it's going to grow like 1% a year, which is flat, if not negative.
Yeah.
Take us home on this issue. We
Yeah,
need
so
to
I
move
think,
on.
the important thing for people to know is that this discussion has just begun. The city council has not made a decision. This is not going to appear on the April ballot. There will be more work sessions where city council and staff deliberate on this. Ultimately, the current framework that was discussed last night would require council to have a public hearing on this or have it introduced in May and then have a public hearing by the second meeting for city council in May if they then want to put it on the August 2026 ballot, which is the current iteration of this idea. We'll see if that happens. A lot of work is to be done. There's not even ballot language yet, as was discussed, right? Because this, again, they've just started this discussion. So for anyone listening, if you have thoughts or comments on this is just the beginning. Communicate with your council representative. I'm sure at some point there will be a segment on the city's website for comments to be submitted. But you'll just stay on the lookout. Again, this is coming up. There'll probably be another work session, I imagine, in April or March as well. and Como Vanguard will cover it as well. So be sure to subscribe.
Are you aware of any designs that are in progress right now for a new police station?
We are looking at the Limon building on Limon Industrial. So the city has owned that building for several years. I don't know the full history there, but we're looking at potentially using that existing facility for a new police department with some
Permanent one
upgrades.
rather than a temporary one, while you could rebuild one downtown?
I think so. I think
Why wouldn't
if
you
we're
want a
going to
police station
come,
downtown?
that's a great question. So from what
I
I
think there are a
hear,
couple of corners at Providence and Broadway that would be perfect for a new police station. There's property for sale right now on the southeast corner.
yeah, I think the police department is exploring their options. So I don't think we're
Mhm.
settled on any one thing.
I guess the reason I ask that question is because if this does come to a ballot in August, do voters need to see preliminary drawings or plans for a new police station and a location in order to make an intelligent decision? I don't know. I'm just asking. I don't.
Yeah, I think
Nick,
it's
you're
a.
a council member in the past, so you might have.
I think it's a good question. I do think to Sydney's point that, and this has been an ongoing thing for several years now, especially since Chief Schluty has assumed the role more so than ever, that CPD is exploring every single option.
Mm.
I would suspect that, well, I shouldn't say suspect. I think we would all agree if this passes, that changes the direction they're going to go.
Yeah, I will say so. I feel like if this is approved to be on the ballot, we'll probably have some more concrete answers by then so we can clearly explain to people based on what we anticipate to come in with what we can do. There are some benefits to looking at that Limon site. It's quick, fast access to the highway. So sometimes it can actually be pretty efficient to get somewhere quickly versus downtown traffic, which can be a bit of a nightmare depending on the time of day. But we're also looking at bringing back the downtown unit. So we're going to have some sort of, landing spot I anticipate in time for the officers.
Substation, something like that at
That will
least.
be downtown. And I know in the past we've used like the district, for
Mhm.
example, but as we bring that unit back and depending on how many officers that involves, et cetera, we'll have to find some resources for them as well. So I think all of that will become more clear in time. I do anticipate if this is approved by council to be on the ballot, that those sort of questions, that exact question most likely will come up. And so that might move that timeline a little bit. But I will say looking at an existing building and making renovations can also be significantly more cost effective than building new.
Which
So
Limon building are you talking about? I'm not
This
familiar.
is the Limon building on Limon Industrial Boulevard that we're referring to is the old IBM building. So think 2008, 2010, something like that. It was built and developed as part of Ready's economic development initiatives. IBM came in, made the deal with us. They had it for 10 years, which was their contract length. They no longer needed it because everybody went remote.
yep.
And now the city owns this large office complex, uh, and no one is using it. So that's why CPD, among others with the city, have really tried to come up with ideas like, well, how can we best utilize this space? And to City's point, certainly because they already own it. The city already owns it. IBM paid for it essentially in terms of its building and fitting. So it's a building in good condition. Think, what, a couple years ago, Veterans United almost took it, but then that didn't happen. So it is one opportunity, whether it's CPD or someone else. I mean, frankly, either the city is going to end up utilizing itself or it needs to sell it.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of what we're looking at right now. And the beauty of that location is it is a super nice building. I have been inside and it's like pristine as far as office buildings go. It's got like a kitchen space, and so I think it can meet a lot of their needs. But I think there's also some land, so there's more opportunity if they need, some sort of additional space for training purposes or storage, vehicles, etc. It could work for those purposes too.
Yeah, and there's opportunity for other departments. I know Public Works has talked about like, oh, we could use it for salt storage.
Yeah, the
and
way the
other
city's
things.
growing, we're like busting at the seams. I know our poor health department is always like, we could use more space. So I'm sure we could find a use for it. And if not for the city, then obviously we would look at selling it and seeing if there's any employers in town who might be able to use it too.
Might keep a precinct building or a small office downtown, I would hope.
Oh, I anticipate that, especially as we talk about bringing the downtown unit back. We'll have more officers in the area and dedicated to specifically downtown.
They should consider naming rights. That seems to be popular among certain entities.
Yes, or let's just name the snow plaza. That would
Yeah,
be
that'd be a good
nicer.
fundraiser.
Yes.
Well, let's move on from the sales tax. Again, that's a little ways down the road, but it's coming, folks. Keep it on your radar. We certainly will. I know it will not be the last time we talk about it on this show. So last night, a number of items got approved. We had council approve the annexation of property for the, speaking of public safety, Fire Station 10 coming in east side of Columbia at the corner of Highway WW and El Chaparral. That got approved so that it can actually move forward. I think they're going to, and correct me if I'm wrong, Sydney, I believe they're going to demo what's there and build something from scratch? Or is this one where they're adapting the existing building, which is a church?
Yes, that.
They're adapting it.
Yes.
Okay.
So there's an existing church, and they're going to adapt that to service some administration offices. I believe the marshal's office is going to go out there. So they're the ones that investigate, like, hey, what started this fire? So they'll be working out of that location and then in time build,
A
for
separate
an
building,
apparatus
right?
and so on and so forth.
Okay. Gotcha. And then really the rest of the night, I would say, was really focused on communication efforts
Yeah, I think
of all
somewhat
kinds.
accidentally and somewhat purposefully.
Yeah.
Well, and that is in regard to, I know there were a lot of compliments, and I talked to the head of the Parks and Rec Commission or whatever
Mhm.
that official title is. Anyway, I saw Dan Devine Jr., and he was talking about how the response to what was planned for the Douglas Park basketball courts was very commendable and very much a lot of people complimented the Parks and Rec Department for listening.
Yes. So my employee, Shauna Johnson, who is the city's engagement coordinator, worked closely with Gabe on that project. And it's not often that people come to council with the intention of solely complimenting staff, and so I think it was really nice to hear, in that space, but I think for Gabe, that was a learning moment, and I council members and community members pointed out that when you have such a public job and everything that you do can be scrutinized online or elsewhere, it's takes an act of bravery to step back and go, "You know what? I think we made a mistake. Let's acknowledge it and talk to people to figure out how we can adjust."
But if people wanted to know why in the world was it an MU themed basketball court complex there with a name on it that people, I be honest with you, I knew Willie Cox when he coached with the Missouri women's basketball team, and I like the gentleman. He was a terrific man and a terrific gentleman, but I was still surprised when the initial information came out that his name would be on that court because I did not know he had any association with Douglas Park. So, but I think you have to step back and say, didn't the University of Missouri also contribute money to the project, or did they not?
So it's my understanding that athlete in town came forward and wanted to donate money to the project and wanted it to take that MU theme and obviously be a tribute to Coach Cox. And so Parks and Rec was working with them, and that's kind of how it came to be. I'm not positive if that location was chosen just because we knew there needed to be work done. I'm pretty sure that's the case. Nick's
Yeah.
nodding yes. So I'm going to say confidently yes. But we heard a lot of feedback from the community quickly when that news came out that they didn't feel like that resonated with the neighborhood and with the history of the park. And
I'm glad it turned out as it did because I think it makes perfect sense to see what we've seen. But again, you have to go back and say if there was some contribution that was tied to the original plan, then that makes sense also. And I understand now that the word is that another park will show that kind of theme or that dedication to that particular idea of recognizing MU sports at another park, yet to be determined.
correct. Yeah. We're not abandoning the project. We're just going to transition where that takes place. And that way we can better honor the history of Douglas Park, with the feedback we heard from residents who have history there, but still go forward with honoring Coach Cox in another location as well. So
So that
next
is an
steps.
example of what you're talking about, the theme of communication. The communication was listened to, it was responded to, and a very good result happened.
If I may.
Yeah. Go ahead.
I feel strongly that there's a big difference, and while they tie closely together, there's a difference between engagement and communications. And I think when something goes really well, it oftentimes takes both. So I think cities historically communicate. We tell people this is happening. We tell you when you can show up, and then we tell you what came out of that interested parties meeting, for example. But this was an example where, our engagement coordinator and Gabe Huffington got together and go, okay, how can we have this conversation? And we had 3 parties where it really wasn't us talking. It was us listening and hearing what people felt in that space and what they wanted to honor and their own stories from that area. And then just being a part of that conversation and meeting them where they're at. And I think sometimes that can be difficult for cities to do just because it's not what we've always done. And this was a good example of both things taking place.
Yeah, this was, and I think council members, citizens, staff all last night agreed that that is like that was the magic of this and something that they would like to see recreated and for everything, or ideally, skipping past the portion where maybe not having the issue in the first place because you have the not only the communication but also the engagement piece. So folks you may not know, this idea first came to council last February 2025, and that is when there was kind of the pushback from citizens. And as somebody, me, who used to live pretty close to Douglas Park, heavily utilize the park, very important to the community there. It means a lot. A lot of events take place there. And so I was not surprised, frankly, when that pushback happened, because I too was like, I mean, it's nice that Mizzou or this, foundation or this donor, whomever wants to help offset the cost of this and honor someone in the process. I don't think anyone has an issue with that idea, but it was curious where it was like, well, what does that have to do with Douglas Park? And so, this is 1 year in the making now, is the kind of the point I'm getting to, where it's like the city and the citizens who cared, neither side gave up and both leaned in to produce what we now have approved by City Council last night, which is meaningful and now representative of the people who actually utilize the park and who the park means something to because it's a part of their community. It's not just, another MU brand somewhere in town.
Yeah, and I think one beautiful thing that came out of those conversations too was more than just the basketball courts. I mean, we had conversations with residents about safety in the park, about infrastructure, whether that's like the restrooms or can we
Water
get a
fountain.
water
We're
fountain?
getting a water fountain.
It's important. You got to stay hydrated when
Yep.
you're shooting hoops. But and programming. That was another huge thing we heard. I think the park historically had a lot more programming that took place there. Those are conversations that we want to continue. And now that we've gathered the input on the basketball courts and figured out the next steps for that and can move forward, we're going to invite people back to the table to continue that conversation and tell us your experience, and let's maybe bring someone from the police department to the table to talk about what we could do around security, for example.
Well, I think this is a good segue, if we can, to the reorganization of the city's communication staff. And we should preference that or preface that with saying Sydney Olsen here is leaving the city of Columbia next month.
Yes, March 27th will
March
be my last
27th is
day.
her last day. After 5 years of service to the city, she's leaving. And coincidentally, after she exits, the city manager is proposing to reorganize and centralize the city's communication efforts that both exist and also fill in the void on some things that don't exist. Sydney, would you like to expand on that?
Yes, I could talk about this for years probably. DeCarlin Seawood and I started this conversation actually prior to my decision to leave. And so we've had a lot of conversation about what communication looks like, what it should look like. And I think one thing I can say confidently in Columbia is that it's taken almost every iteration I think it could at this point. So an important point to clarify, as much as I would like to think it takes 25 people to replace one me, haha, that is just simply not true. The positions that are proposed include one new position, which is a director role, which would replace my current role, and the other positions within that are already existing. Now, there may be some title changes, some, reorganization that way, but they're not brand new positions. And I can explain some background to this. So, the city has the contact center, which, if you call or chat or email us, most likely that's who you're reaching out to. So, they're our first stop for residents who have questions or concerns. And they're a big support for communications because they tell us what people are asking about. We've also had, when I came on board, our marketing and our communications were kind of split up in two different areas. And we've had some vacancies in the last few months. And so we felt like it would make sense with that in place to make a change while there's no one in those roles and kind of bring those together so that they can work more cohesively. Make sense? Clear as mud?
Okay. Yeah. I've got a couple of questions. First of all, one of the things you just recently said, I am skeptical of marketing being too closely tied to communication because I believe that becomes propaganda. And that's a media person speaking. And I don't know how you feel about that, but I'm curious. I am concerned because I think communication is responding to questions honestly and sometimes uncomfortably, and marketing doesn't like to deal with that.
Mm, yeah, very true. I would say, in my experience, marketing in the public sector is probably different than what people think of in the private sector because we're not typically selling something, if that makes sense.
But the perception is that you
Sure.
are selling a point of view that the city wants to sell to its citizens, and not always one that the citizens will say is the right sell.
Sure, sure. No, I completely understand that argument. I think my experience working with marketing is we always kind of tell people that my side of the house, the communication side, creates the message. They're the ones that are responsible for packaging it and getting it out. So, our marketing team historically has worked with agencies in town who market things like the airport, for example. Another example we have is our community summit coming up. This is a big event where we invite people to City Hall to come give feedback on our strategic plan priority areas and just generally how are we doing. And when it's an event that quite literally everyone is invited to, you kinda have to get creative on how to reach people, and so we're putting some marketing dollars behind that to reach people in different ways. Because I think the one thing we heard last night, and over the years has been that people want their information quickly, they want it in different ways, and there are some ways they just don't want it, and that changes from person to person.
Here's the other thing that surprised me when I was looking at the information about what the city manager is proposing. 25 full-time PR people is I understand that's not the titles, but from outside looking in, it's like, and I know that you're saying only adding one, and that's fine, but I'm thinking 24 exist now? What the heck are they doing?
Yeah, a
It's
lot
just
of
like
them
that
are.
that's too many, in my opinion. There even 24 departments in the city.
Yeah, a lot of them are in the contact center. So we have several people, I'd say about half of that makes up the contact center. We have 4 part-time people, which are the community connectors. We have 2 graphic designers, 1 web developer. I know I'm gonna forget people here. We have a public information specialist. And so again, also when we talk about the marketing side, a lot of it is that creative services is how we refer to it in the city. So that's like, okay, we have a meeting coming up. We need posters, we need social media graphics, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Doesn't always mean we're putting marketing behind it in the traditional sense of paying for people to see it, if that makes sense. One point of clarity.
Yeah,
I
I do
still
think.
thought that was a lot of full-time employees for and the way that it was communicated in the information.
Yeah, I do agree with David on that, and at the same time, that the clarity helps explain it in terms of half of that being the people sitting in the contact center and answering the phone calls and emails from people who every single day having issues with utilities. There's a pothole. How do I do this or that with the city? All those things. That definitely helps explain it. This did not do that last night. Now, obviously, this was just on introduction and first read, so it's forthcoming. Um,
Yes.
but I'm sure that'll be something that the city and you and DeCarlin and all spend some more time discussing. Because as I think when you and I spoke last night, I shared that when I was first reading through it, it appeared to me that most of them were new roles because of how it was phrasing things. When in reality, as we now said, that is not the case.
Yes, I think we got plenty of feedback that that council memo was not clear. And I think that's partly why the mayor had asked the city manager last night to provide some clarity on that point, even though it was on introduction and first read, which you clarified earlier, typically doesn't involve conversation. They felt like it was necessary to provide some clarity around this, and there's a possibility that he may be gone at the next meeting, and this is his proposal for the organization moving forward. So I think we're going to have to do a better job of talking about what that means and what's existing versus what's new, et
Let me
cetera.
ask you this because you were talking about how you and the city manager sat down and this was, I think you said prior to you knowing you were going
Mhm.
to resign from this position, but you have 5 years of experience in what you've been doing. What were the weaknesses that you identified for the city saying we could do this better? We need to do this better. We're not doing it well right now.
Okay. How much time do we have? No, just kidding.
Unlimited.
I just obviously feel passionately about this because it's what I do all day, but To me, we kind of always drop the ball when it comes to broader messaging. So, for context, we have communication staff in most of our departments. So, the police department has communication staff, the fire department, the health department, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And they do a really good job of getting information out on the day to day. Like, we're having a meeting or we're seeking feedback on this or, whatever. We have a survey. But I think where we really miss the target is talking more broadly about issues. So, public safety, it's no secret, has been a huge conversation in the community, especially in the last 6 months, but last several years. And I think we need to do a better job of having people pull folks together that need to be part of that conversation and go, how are we updating people broadly on what we're doing around public safety? Because that doesn't just involve the police department. It involves the police department, it can involve the health department, it can involve, a number of departments in making sure we're telling that story. I think we tend to get lost in the day to day of we have a meeting coming up, we need to get something out because we need people to give feedback because it has to go to council by this day, et cetera, et cetera. And we just don't do a good job telling our story. So my hope is for the future of the organization, whatever the department or iteration of my role looks like, that the person in this role next will definitely be equipped to do that and get some buy-in from departments.
Curious as to, and this is going to be kind of specific and not growing exactly from what you just said, but you did bring up the police department, and they have a communications department. And you used to be in media, as I've said already a couple of times during this interview. I have a frustration. I have subscribed or whatever it is, so I get the alerts that come to say there was a robbery at 5th Street and Broadway. It doesn't tell you that it was at a bank or doesn't give you the business, which I think it should, because I think that people want to know specifically what the target was. So that's one frustration I have. The other frustration I have is that media here, and it's a joke to me, when they report it as a story, it's basically word for word what the release has been. So my question is, if I'm a news person, do I have the opportunity and the right to contact that spokesman for the police department and say, I got your release. Now tell me this. Who was it? When was it? Why did it happen? Give me further details than that brief description. But nobody's doing that very often, if at all, in any of the news media. So I'm getting worked up over the media's lack of pressing the police department to say, I mean, more. It happens in every major city. I get the Kansas City Star, I subscribe to that. They give you flesh out more than what the initial communication from a department wants you to hear. And media in town, that's the point. You need to do more than just rely on marketing and communication from the city.
Okay, so I will defend them a bit on this because our media partners do email semi-frequently with questions following a release. I also have feelings as someone who's worked on both sides of this. And obviously, I think our police department gets the most traction as far as news, and working at KMIZ, like we covered a lot of crime-based news. And I've seen the standards change over time depending on, who's leading the department or who's leading communications there. And this is another thing that I continually talk to DeCarlin about is I think we need some standards so that the target's not always moving. And I thought the conversation last night, to tie it back to the council meeting about how our departments are notifying people of different things, is a good example. Like, why are we not doing it the same way across the board? Wouldn't it make sense to have some standard practices? And when I was a news reporter, I spent a lot of time. Frankly, I went to the courthouse every single day before my shift and read court documents. And so a lot of times what you couldn't get from those press releases, you could get from that. There's been a lot of discussion about what should and shouldn't, what can and cannot be released in those news releases from the police. I'm not an attorney, so, I think from my media background, I have thoughts on that. But also I listen to our attorneys who also have thoughts on that. But I think, there needs to be space for that conversation to take place.
Well, two things. I think the questions need to be asked. And if it is no comment, you report there's no comment. The other thing I would say, and again, this is more targeted at media. Media needs to establish relations and relationships with people. And we can't do that with the turnover at the J school. That's not going to happen. it can happen at more established media points. And so I imagine it is happening at some places, but I wasn't technically a news person when I worked on the radio station. But I established relationships with the police chief or with the sheriff or with somebody else. And they told me many things occasionally, rarely on the air, but off the air, that would give me a context for what was happening. And I don't think that there is enough investment. You can make the point, which you did earlier in this hour, about the fact that we may have more journalists per capita, but you're using the term journalist very loosely, in my opinion.
Well, I'll just
So,
add, I mean, it's the quality, right?
that's my point.
And if it was there, we wouldn't be here.
Yeah, well, yeah. So, like I said, I remember being that journalism student, and so I remember not knowing what I was doing and going to your first city council meeting and trying to build relationships. And I was lucky to have stayed in this market. And so by the time I was at ABC 17 News, I had a lot of those relationships, specifically, for example, with the police department. So there were times where we could have conversations, that add some additional context. But I agree. And I visit journalism classes at the university semi frequently. And I try to hammer that point home. And I'm sorry, David and I are going to start another podcast on media. So
We
excuse
should.
us. I would anytime. But I try to hammer that point home to them that you may not have the ability to do it in Columbia because of what you're told to do for class, et cetera, and just the limited time you have. But you do have to build relationships because you rely on these resources as much as, they rely on you. And that doesn't mean you can't hold them accountable. You should. That is part of your role. But you also don't want to approach every single story like you're going to uncover some hidden conspiracy theory truth because it makes people distrustful. And, one example, I was talking to a reporter who said they were interviewing someone who was crying and they had asked for them not to use the portion where they were crying on camera. And the professor or the class made a point that they can't ask you to do that. And I said, that is true. But the story that you described to me is not exactly the hardest hitting journalism. So is that the time that you want to burn that resource over a story for that? So anyway, we're going into the weeds maybe, but
we should talk more about that because that would be an interesting conversation to have about what you just said. And I know we need to move on, but thank you. And if I may ask one more question, then I will end my participation in it for this time. I know there was conversation last night, and the term geofencing was used a lot.
yes.
And I'm sorry, I may be dense. I may have missed out that class, but I can surmise what it is, but for those who may be as illiterate as I am, please give us a geofencing explanation.
You are not illiterate. I think this is a newer trend. But for context, the city is looking at purchasing a software that would allow us to text residents if they opt in to receive those. And geofencing would basically allow us to draw a circle around an area and target people within that area to send alerts. So we were looking at how can we utilize this for example, water main breaks, or a big one that came up last night was a lot of our businesses downtown want to know when construction's taking place or something that may impact parking. So I made the point that we could build out a list and people could opt in if they work downtown or own a business downtown to receive alerts on upcoming work. But the geofencing is really just allowing us to target a specific area and then message the people within that if they choose to receive those.
Exciting.
Okay, I was like, it was not a great explanation.
Exciting. Well, well, I'll say one thing more on the communications things for the city, and then we'll transition, which is I'm interested to see how it plays out because, as you noted, the city has had a lot of different versions of how it has organized and operated its communications over the last 10 years, let alone just the last 5 years, right? And this is a hybrid approach where the departments will maintain their own communicators, right, their own staff, and the city will have its centralized people. And as someone who has spent a lot of time in City Hall, and saying you don't have to comment on this if you don't want to. There are silos with departments who do not want to necessarily have their communication handled by anyone but themselves. And so I imagine with this hybrid approach, there will be some contention and some friction, not universally, but maybe between one department and the central communication staff and what have you. I look forward to observing that because I know that's going to happen, and I'm curious to see how it is handled and who ends up having the power in that situation, right? Because it's one thing to have a centralized communication staff. It's not a thing for that staff to have any actual authority.
Yes, I can speak just in my own experience in my role. So, coming when I came on board at the city, I was like a one man ship. I was the public information officer at that time, and I didn't have any staff or a team. So, it took me quite a quite a bit of time to kind of find my feet in the organization. And it was a transition period. It was John Glasscock's last year, and we knew that. And so some of that played a factor too. But I kind of see the city manager's communication staff role as we're the view from big city C. We are all part of the big city. We're all part of the same organization. And yes, I promise we're all special. We're all of the most important, but we have to sometimes view things in a way from our constituents and not from the view of the police department or the health department, not picking on any
Mhm.
two particularly. And so there have been instances where even in my role, although I'm not a director, I do have to come in the room and some people go, no, what did I do? Or what now? But I go, it's not bad, I promise. And kind of working with them through the view of what we're trying to achieve. And then also it's important, my 2 cents, take it or leave it for the next person in the role to listen to their perspective too, because I always tell them I'm not a cop and I'm not an engineer. I'm not paving streets. So I also need to leave room to hear their perspective on maybe why we're communicating a certain way or how making changes could impact that. So it takes a person with some balance and the ability to do that and kind of convey what's important from the constituents' perspective with that more broad view while still understanding their role as well.
I think you put it well, Nick, though, as and Missourians would say, let's show me that it makes
Yes.
a difference and show me that it's going to work.
I wish your replacement, the soon to be communications director, whoever that ends up being, the best of luck.
Me too. And whenever we pick whoever that is, call me. I'll take you to coffee and we can chat.
Oh, don't worry. We'll have him on the podcast.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
But I want a hard cut before we end. The last item that happened last night, really at the end of the meeting, was Aaron Keyes, utilities director, shared that the Water and Light Advisory Board unanimously recommended to City Council to move forward with the Vater School Road transmission line project. That's been going on for over a decade. Or rather, it hasn't been happening for the last decade. There seems to be a consensus, not only now unanimously amongst the Water and Light Board, but amongst council, at least in terms of moving it forward. And so the public input process will begin in the coming weeks. For folks listening, that project is going all the way down Grindstone, down West Nifong Boulevard, going up North Scott Boulevard, connecting the Perch Creek substations and the Grindstone substation. And so, again, this has been controversial for a number of years. It's finally having an attempt to move forward. Again, kind of like the communications department, I look forward to witnessing that. I imagine, as Don Waterman, the councilman for the 5th Ward, noted last night, and this is happening in his ward, I agree with him. I doubt thoughts have changed much on the subject and that there will still be people who are upset that it's going down where they're proposing, but keep an eye out for that. We certainly will, and we'll see what happens.
And people who are not directly in the path or related to that pathway that you just described, they're going to be very concerned about it. But everybody else is going to look at the price of the two options and say, it makes no sense to spend $20 million more to make a different part of the neighborhood angry.
Yes. And this is a great example. This project, because it's massive and it'll take multiple years, even if it's approved, is a great example of everything we talked about today, which is the city's going to have to be on top of its communication and engagement strategy, or else it's going to feel the pain.
Oh, yes. I was already texting Erin last night when she was up there, like, here are my thoughts on how some ways we can reach people, because this is one of those projects where while it may have a more direct impact on the people who might look at it, for example, if it's near their home, it still has an impact on everyone. And so, this is one of those examples where I'm like, hey, we should probably reach out to our utility customer list and let them know this is happening. We should email everyone who subscribes to Be Heard Como. Really like get it out there so people know, and also make room for our media partners to come in and ask questions, because this project started long before I even worked at the city. And frankly, I was young at the time and didn't care. And most of our journalists are in that same space where they're going to go, what's this now? And so making sure we leave space for them to come in and ask questions, get the history of the project so they can convey correctly what's going on and have a good understanding of that too.
The other part of this is something that we've mentioned before, Nick, and that is that the council members have to have the will to do that tough decision because many of them have accused previous councils of not having the guts or whatever
Kicking
word
the can down the road.
yeah,
Right.
of going ahead and saying, let's handle this now.
Hmm.
And so now it's going to be handled.
We'll see.
Yeah.
That's
Well,
that
it should
seems
be.
that's the direction they're moving in
Yeah.
for now. We'll see what happens. Well, with that, Sydney Olsen, whatever your title is,
Engagement
Doesn't matter.
coordinator,
I'm gonna just
communication.
go.
Yeah.
Yeah, you never stop being the public information officer to me, so you'll always be my PIO for the city.
Great.
But
I'll answer to that.
yes, thank you so much for coming on the show. You're walking out the door in a month or so. Thank you for working for the city of Columbia for 5 years. I feel like that's maybe a weird thing for me to say to some people, but those of us who know how City Hall operates and the toll it takes, because it is not just a 9 to 5 job any day of the week, I do appreciate your willingness to serve our municipal government, and I think it's better for it. So thank you for that.
Thank you for saying that. And thank you for having me on as a guest. It's been a pleasure in my time to work with both of you. So
Let me know when you want to do the podcast on media.
call me
Maybe
anytime.
we'll produce a special episode for the two of you on that.
Deal.
As a reminder to our listeners, we would love to have questions and comments from you all. You can go to comovanguard.com, submit those questions. We have not received any yet. And so the first person to do so, you will be setting a historic precedent. And we would love to shout you out on the show, answer your question, hear your comment, talk about it with our next guest. Speaking of which, our next episode coming out 2 weeks from today will be with Councilman Don Waterman with the Fifth Ward. He will be our guest on the next show. And so keep that in mind. If you have questions for him, comments, please submit those. Again, comovanguard.com. You can support the show there. You can submit questions. You can find the written reports for Como Vanguard on Substack there as well. Thank you for listening. And David?
I'll just say this. Nick worked extra hard, and he does every week that there's a council meeting to get his Como Vanguard print edition out very early the following morning. So he probably hasn't slept all night. So if you want to receive that, you can subscribe on that. I don't know how, Substack or whatever. Just subscribe. Go to Como Vanguard, and you can support the podcast through that also, and
That's
support
right.
Nick's writing because he does a good job, and he's got a staff also that's looking at planning and zoning. So that's pretty cool.
And I almost forgot. Thank you, David, for the reminder. We always want to give a shout out to our in-person host, Jay Sparks, Marker Squeak Consulting, who continues to be very generous in providing his studio space so that we can record this podcast. If you don't know Jay Sparks, you should get to know him. Look him up on LinkedIn. Go to Marker Squeak Consulting on Facebook or online and give him a ring. Great guy, great service. We appreciate him for helping us make this happen. Thank you all for listening. We'll see you next time.